So for Module 5, I'll be answering Melissa Futrell's question. Her question is, do you believe that Europe actually benefited from inequality by raising the labor wages and lowering food prices after losing half their population from the Black Death? What industries have seen the most increase in earnings? Do you find any troubling similarities in today's society? So I think that this chapter, what it showed us again, what it emphasized, although we were now talking about disasters that were levelers that were not man-made, we were talking about plagues and pandemics, and what we saw is that this reinforced similar dynamics that we saw in other situations like conflicts like civil wars and total wars. We saw basically that the power of the rich to have influence over the political process was how they were able to maintain their control over societies and over the levels of inequality that existed. And we know that the prior instances, whether it was total war or other circumstances, or revolution, they were able to wrest away the connection between the elite and their ability to enforce the levels of inequality that existed in society and prevent the poor from exercising political power to to remove some of that inequity. So obviously, one of the main parts of that, if we think about the power of unions, for instance, was that you had labor markets that were basically at the mercy of the landowning elites and the factory owners, whatever time in history it may have been. There was a control and a power that they had that the lower income farm and factory wage earners could not really fight against because um, the demand for labor was high, but there was a large labor pool. There was very little way for those groups to coalesce together in the way that eventually unions did, to sort of hold a united front against the power of the landowners and the factory owners. So obviously, the plague removing the labor force, diminishing the labor force by such a high degree, um, put the positions of the landowners um, in a very precarious place because they suddenly were in such need of this labor, and there was such a shortage, there was such a small labor pool that they were forced to acquiesce to the demands of the poor. There are some quotes early on in the chapter which describe the way that the historians of the period, or those who were writing about the plague and what it did to the workforce, they were talking about the greed and the arrogance, ironically, of the poor, because the poor finally had negotiating power, and this was a way for them to use it effectively, in the sense that they could basically say, well, we know that there are almost no other people to work, and if you don't acquiesce to our demands, that you will simply not be able to produce and to create surplus and to create wealth. So what we see there is that the elites, in the same way that in prior times, the low wage population was not able to show a unified front and resist the temptation to accept these lower wages, because of course if they all united together and agreed to not accept these lower wages and to strike, then there would have been a force there that would have made the factory owners and the landowners acquiesce to their demands and pay them the higher wages. And of course, in this situation, the landowners needed their lands to be farmed, and they did try to pass laws that would, through the crown and through the kings, they did try to pass laws that in several countries in Europe during the Black Plague, that would have forced employees to work for rates that were similar to the ones that they would have accepted, wages that they would have accepted before the plagues began. But of course, these fell apart quite quickly. Scheidel talks about this because these landowners caved in quickly. They were too nervous, and when people ignored these royal decrees, these laws, the landowners said, "Well, I guess we have no choice, and we'll have to pay these higher wages." So we see there that basically the political power of the rich, who were able to usually they were able to um, either work through the political system or with connection to the crown to enforce the standards which maintain this inequality. And all we see from the pandemics and from the plagues is that it was impossible for the wealthy to maintain that grip on the political process to tilt it in their favor, in the same way that it was impossible for them to do this for instance, in this descriptions of the Japanese during World War II, when the entire economy became focused around this total war effort, and the rich were not able to manipulate the political power to maintain their levels of inequality. So I think that if we look at it from that perspective, um, this was a good example of how political power is so vital and to maintaining inequality, regardless of the power of the wealthy. If they are not able to put their hands on to influence the political process, it doesn't matter how wealthy they are, and we've seen that that wealth can be stripped from them quickly. I think in the end, unfortunately, because the loss of life was so severe, we do see how entrenched this connection between political power and the influence of the rich is, that it obviously was a win for the the poor of European society, but it was at the cost of massive amounts of the working poor in Europe. So I think that although obviously the inequality they faced before and after was severe, that if the cost of gaining rights and livable wages for the poor is something like a plague, obviously that's not a price that we should be willing to pay, but it does show us just exactly what throughout history it has taken to wrest away that kind of control, political control from the wealthy, and how important it is to create systems within our own political systems that will um, create a buffer between the political process and the influence that the rich have over it, because we see that in medieval history and in European history that that was the only um, mechanism which created equality, or was a leveler of significant stature, was something as destructive and as deadly as the plagues of the Middle Ages.